Writers, painters, and filmmakers use different media to stimulate our imagination through different techniques. In a variety of ways, these artists invite us to participate in the story that they are telling, either in a book, a painting, or a movie, by creating situations to make us part of the fantasy with mental creations. However, do we imagine similarly when stimulated by the same sources? What three artists living in the same place but in different times, exposed to similar influences and references, imagine and express artistically? We will see how a place and life context boosts and impacts an individual imagination, and how these artists share their feelings and thoughts about their lives with the audience, reflecting universal themes, and at the same time responding to the demands of the times in which they live. We will examine the work of the Lords of Dunsany in writing, paintings, and filmmaking to elucidate what and how artists with similar inspiration express themselves creatively in different media and times. We will also point out the perspectives of Karl Kroeber in make-believe in film and fiction to examine how they invite their readers and audience to participate in their fantasy. The three artists of Dunsany, the writer Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, the 18th Lord Dunsany, the painter Edward John Carlos Plunkett, 20th Lord Dunsany, and the filmmaker Randal Plunkett, 21st Lord Dunsany, were taught to preserve the Dunsanian core values.
We are told that we must leave, something. The whole point of Dunsany and the importance of what happens here is you get Dunsany. Your job is to live as a caretaker of Dunsany. That's the building, the land, the history, the heritage, and the future.
The Lords of Dunsany succeed in the peerage, establishing continuity as caretakers of the Plunkett's values. As custodians of the history and heritage, the artists of Dunsany found in the obligation a way to extract inspiration, using their estate as a stage for literary stories, visual art, and movies. Knowing that the three lords were taught about these values, to assume their responsibility raises the question of where the artistic veins come from.
Was I destined to have these thoughts, or was the reality of my life on the wall? Is all the things I find around me gearing us all in this direction? Because if you were to compare me to, let's say, my great-grandfather, a lot of the behavior is very similar. So is that the genetics, or is that the place? That, unfortunately, I don't have an answer for, because it really depends. I'd say it probably is a mixture of both.
Being caretaker in Dunsany embraces not only the property and heirlooms, but also the memory, achievements, and creations of those who passed. Nowadays, Randal Plunkett is a creative of the film industry who creates and promotes the art of his predecessors, expressed in different ways and reflecting different world contexts and uncertainties.
My job is to look after the castle, the estate, the history, and also try and promote the ones who never had a chance, like my father, like my great-grandfather.
Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett, 18th Lord Dunsany, was a famous Irish fantasist. His work embraces novels, plays, essays, poetry, non-fiction pieces, autobiographies, short stories, and clay miniatures. He inspired writers such as H.P. Lovecraft, J.R.R. Tolkien, also filmmakers such as Guillermo del Toro. He was the only writer to have 5 plays simultaneously on Broadway. He was also nominated for the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1950. Dunsany Estate is entwined with its fantastic world through indications of locations, also references to hobbies, personalities, and the peerage as the examples that follow. A dog, but there I was, a cocker spaniel. I know I can rely on you not to say a word about this to anyone. I soon went off with Laura to see her rock garden and to talk about our land. The primrose had the same appearance of having strayed there from the woods that squirrels have when they enter a walled garden. I could sit and draw today in detail just exact as any artist with his model before him. And the first of these three things is Laura standing in her rock garden. Lord Dunsany was a keen chess player, inventing Dunsany's chess, an asymmetrical chess variant. He was president of both the Irish Chess Union and the Kent County Chess Association for some years, and of Seven Oaks Chess Club for 54 years. In The Curse of the Wise Woman, page 142, we can read, "Nobody standing behind a chess player and watching him play can learn half as much of chess as the man that is playing against him, for rivalry is the essence of the game as it is of the woods." It is known that Lord Dunsany's uncle, the cooperative pioneer Sir Horace Plunkett, helped to manage the estate and investments for a time. About this relationship, we have a note in The Curse of the Wise Woman. "An uncle, my father's younger brother, has now become my guardian. He was a man of charming manner, and let me do what I liked, in return for which I naturally gave my consent to whatever he recommended in the affairs of the estate that my father had left me. He never spoke of finance without smiling." The place and the Dunsanian way of life are entangled in many of Lord Dunsany's stories. The Curse of the Wise Woman, for example, bring reference to the peerage and the name repetition in the family storyline. I should explain perhaps that our family have always been called James Charles or Charles James, father and eldest son alternatively. They gave us a medal and that nebulous dukedom, and that is all we got for it. Repetition is one of the most valuable devices of the Plunketts to keep their history through the generations. Through storytelling, they pass on family values and history. Even in a changing Ireland, these repetitions are pillars that help the family stand for almost 1,000 years at the same place with the same position. The world changes outside, however the Plunketts keep their values and rules unchanged, managing and surpassing the world's instability. Repeating the names, for example, is a way to keep a chain which connects the past, present and future.
That's not, when you say that out loud, it's quite a thing. To be anywhere for an extended time, but also to be somewhere and still be in a position that we're in. Now, it hasn't always been easy. There has been times where we were near the edge, and there are still times regularly that we're near the edge. But the thing is that when you stop thinking about yourself and you start looking at longevity of generations forward.
The second artist of Dunsany who found inspiration in the estate for his creations is Edward John Carlos Plunkett, the 20th Lord Dunsany. Edward was son of Randal Plunkett with the Brazilian Vera de Sá Sotomayor. This connection with Brazil is important to mention since Edward lived in the tropical nation until he was 7 years old. When the 18th Lord Dunsany brought him back to Ireland, Edward couldn't speak English, just Brazilian Portuguese, presenting to his writer grandfather the difficult task to raise a child with a lack of communication. But soon Edward learned English and was studying at Eton. Eddie Plunkett showed marked talent for painting and has since become an abstract artist. It is interesting to notice Lord Dunsany's criticism in abstract painting. In a letter to Edward on the 8th of February 1956, Lord Dunsany gave his advice: "Beware of the false originality of the people who paint the sun square and green. It has never been done before, or not until recently." At this time, Edward was 17 years old. Despite Lord Dunsany's notes about abstract work, it was too late, and this was the main path of Edward John's career as painter alongside design and architecture. Edward married with the Brazilian architect Maria Alice Carvalho, working with his wife in many architecture projects. Among his famous traditional works are two portraits of Taoiseach Charles Haughey and John Bruton. In design, homeware collection with Dunsany as a brand, and a design set of luxurious perfume, soap and bath salt for Princess Grace of Monaco. He had exhibitions in Ireland, England, Rome, Poland and New York. As painter and designer, Edward received several private commissions which differentiated him from the 18th Lord Dunsany, who was a writer for the public, and even from his son Randal Plunkett, who made movies for a wider audience. Optical illusion, another special feature of Edward's work, can be noticed in several paintings. The walls and doors of Dunsany are presented in a stimulating perspective. The interior of the castle was a source of inspiration which the painter could enjoy as an artist. The land. One of the responsibilities of the lords was depicted by Edward in different moments. This is the estate represented from Edward's point of view, and also a way to catalogue the estate he inherited. Nowadays, Edward's paintings of landscape are an important register of changes. Since his son Randal Plunkett implemented at Dunsany's estate the first private rewilding vegan project in Ireland, these paintings are a mark of the estate's topography before the rewilding project and a change of behaviour towards nature in Randal's era as Lord. Randal Plunkett, 21st Lord Dunsany, is the third artist from Dunsany who found in his duty in being caretaker of his land and heritage an opportunity to create. Randal is an independent filmmaker who uses his estate as set for his creations. His movies Out There, Walt, Prey, horror short films, the suspense drama The Green Sea and Marauders in pre-production were filmed in Dunsany estate, and they are impregnated with references to his life and personal conflicts related to the peerage. It is possible to infer these conflicts when thinking about the repetitive motifs and themes such as duty and freedom. The estate, beyond a set for filming, is a source of inspiration that he proposes to share with the crew, cast and audience.
So I start with a concept, then characters appear. Then images to be. I look at art, I look at paintings, I read books, I watch films, I take the things that I like, aspects. There are things that I look around here and I'm like, right, take that, all of that. Put some nature in there.
Images with words, as Randal calls his poetry book. While walking on the estate, what he sees floods his imagination and becomes pieces of art.
Well, I suppose the pictures were stimulated by the thoughts and the words were part of them. So I would go around, I'd take pictures, and those locations or those things would tell a story, if you like. So they came together, really.
From this spiral of thoughts, the same place brings different stories. Dunsany Estate is a source of inspiration which describes several feelings and projects a variance of art. When it comes my time, will I be like this sundial, lost among the weeds in a place where time has ceased to be?
Well, when I was young, I suppose when I moved here, I was very young, so, having all this forest, and remember that I was living from the city, so from going from the city to having all these new smells, to see all these things you wouldn't see, to be able to not see any people, and then have these adventures in large forests, was it just boosted the idea of the fantasy, and at the same time we were playing games, watching movies, so the imagination was just, it was explosive.
Entwined with Randal's creations are reflections from his past, heritage and future. The Green Sea, for example, brings an image of Simone's home. The animals on the wall are like the hunt trophies of the 18th Lord Dunsany you can find in Dunsany Castle, a remembrance of days and behaviour towards nature which does not reflect Randal's beliefs. In turn, Randal's movies show deer's skulls and antlers as a statement of what now nature represents to Dunsany in his era as Lord.
There's always a common thing. There's a lot of deer in my movie because I'm looking at deer all the time, and I'm always trying to protect the deer from hunters. So all of those things, you see deer antlers in every movie.
Randal Plunkett was largely inspired by paintings under his father's influence and learned how to contemplate art with him. Randal juxtaposes paintings' languages and moving pictures, giving the audience the opportunity to experience Dunsany Estate from his artistic point of view, as Edward did with Randal before. The filmmaker's influences come from several ways, from his early to adult life. However, the noir terror in terror writing by the formerly terrified argues that a creative individual might find in his childhood inspiration to overcome his creative mind.
So my father's obviously an artist. From an early age, we would always be visiting the New York Gallery, and that was our Sunday activity. The nature aspect came more to the same. That came later when we started learning about trees. He would tell us the different plants. Every day when we'd walk, we'd have to learn one name of the thing. And then there would be the stories associated with them, in particular this place, the different trees with the different stories, like the two trees out front.
Edward's influence is so strong in Randal that it is possible to observe nature's depictions like paintings in his movies. Randal gives the viewer the opportunity to contemplate the forest by wide-angle shots or vivid details through close-up. The time he allows the viewer to observe the image before switching with the narrative per se is very similar to the experience of seeing a painting, but with a feature that Kroeber emphasizes to be the most different between the two medias: motion.
He would explain to us the different types of art, the design, the composition. He would explain how composition worked, the idea of splitting the frame and how things were layered into frames. That was always something that we spent time talking about.
As we could see, the artists of Dunsany found in their state and heritage a source of inspiration and furthermore a place to stage their creative work. More than depicts Dunsany estate, their art is a way to bring us inside the estate, not in a real experience but through their creative perception. We see what the lords of Dunsany show us about the place, their feelings and points of view. We saw an imaginary Dunsany, a fantasy world in the real world. After identifying how Dunsany estate stimulated the imagination of the lords of Dunsany, it is interesting to think about how these three artists invited us into their imaginary world. Moreover, what is the difference between imagining while reading a book, seeing a painting, and watching a movie? It is through imagination that this invitation to enter in the lords of Dunsany's world happens. For this reason, let's begin by explaining what happens with our brain when we imagine. When we imagine, we are still forming an image with our visual cortex, but the input is not coming from the retina. Rather, it is coming from a combination of our memory and the creative parts of our brain.
Novels allow readers to participate in the telling of the story in ways that moviegoers cannot. Now, allow me to explain. A written story absolutely requires a participation of the reader's imagination. Think about when a new character is introduced in a novel. We immediately create in our minds a visual representation of that character. We see who they are, a character of our own mental creation.
The difference between imagination when reading and when seeing is also an argument that Karl Kroeber points out. The most distinctive characteristic of verbal make-believe is its freedom from confinement to temporal sequence. If we examine the finest novels, we discover that their telling of new events also revokes what has already been told. The experience of reading a novel is a continuously recursive process. Kroeber argues that reading is recursive because to imagine when reading, we can recur to our memory, knowledge of world and creativity to build imagery to the narrative because, as Kroeber says, the meaning takes form entirely within our mind. And it's free from temporal sequence because language requires time to be. It's not immediate like visual storytelling. For this reason, to read provides opportunity to recreate in mental images the narrative. To exemplify Consul and Kroeber's perspective, let's read this description in The Curse of the Wise Woman by the 18th Lord Dunsany. Heather and ruined towers are the principal objects that meet the eye of the traveller by the road. And in summer, travellers sometimes come that way. Then it is the time to see it, with the heather all in bloom and sunlight on the old towers. What do you imagine? How is the road which leads to the vision of the towers? Is it narrow, wider? Are there any signs of civilization beyond the building that Lord Dunsany describes? If you have never visited Dunsany, the imagery of this description of the curse of the wise woman will not reach the real vision of the place. The description of the road and towers don't match with what we imagine while reading, because verbal texts display the invisible to make us build the imagery with our mind's eyes. With paintings, imagination occurs differently. Non-verbal texts like paintings or photography show us immediately by sight what the creator wants us to see, but with no evidence of what means and how it happened. Let's examine this painting by Edward John Carlos Plunkett, the 20th Lord Dunsany, of his best friend Edoardo Palozzi, also a painter. What we see is a naked woman sitting in Edoardo's lap. We can infer he's uncomfortable or shy by his face, and we can't see the woman's face. However, we see a giant sculpture of a woman's face behind them. Apparently, they are in a study room or creative studio. There's a desk, books, another sculpture, scissors over a red paper or fabric piece. The exercise is not to find the meaning of the painting, but what the painting is not telling us, but making us imagine. Who is this woman? What relationship has she with this man? Why is she naked in his lap? Is the sculpture a reflection of her face, or just another sculpture in the room? Furthermore, is this painting telling us a narrative? According to Kroeber, paintings inspire us to remember or invent stories, but they do not tell us a story, because they don't stimulate us to perceive motion, which marks spatiality and temporality necessary to a narrative. To understand how motion pictures evoke imagination, we must recognize that only movies tell stories visually. This argument of Kroeber is controversial. Many scholarships affirm that narrative painting is not a style, and it is the content of the painting which stimulates the viewer's imagination to generate a narrative. Let's observe this painting of Edward. To Kroeber, this is not a compelling narrative. It will inspire us to remember and invent, but it is not telling a story. But another perspective is to think, what does this canvas suggest that happens before the image in front of you, or even after? What does the environment depict evoke in terms of your perspective of nature, such as the season? What was his intention in painting his heritage, his land? In giving room for the viewer to create these possibilities, the painting becomes a narrative and an invitation to imagine. Another argument of Kroeber is that paintings are static and don't show movement. The author argues that when we see a painting, our eyes and body moves around the static image, but no movement is made by the image per se. I suggest, however, that imagining when seeing paintings gives the viewer the sensation of perceiving the movement by creating the movement in his mind. Let's observe Edward's abstract painting. I will suggest what I imagined when I saw this painting for the first time. I couldn't avoid joining the parts that are separated, imagining this movement of reallocated things. I keep inspecting the painting, trying to fit the details to the place from it belongs. The large square in the background, and even putting it together in my imagination, the puzzle does not match, which makes me keep moving things in perfect symmetry. It is an optical illusion. Edward stimulated us to imagine a movement which does not exist in a static painting, only in our mind. Despite the differences in imagination while reading and seeing a painting, it is possible to imagine while using our eyes to scan such a piece of art. Furthermore, it is possible to create narratives through our memories and personal evocations. Paintings, such as a novel, invites us to imagine even when it brings to our retina part of what we might be able to create ourselves. We don't perceive motion as in a movie, but we imagine events which suggest temporal and spatial dislocation. We move with our mind. You are walking with a woman. You don't know who she is, but you feel relaxed because her dress code is casual and fits the weather. You don't know where she's coming from or where she is heading. You both are just walking together, slowly appreciating the view. When she touches the grass, you might remember the sense of the tickles in your fingers. When she touches the trunk of a tree, you might remember the feeling of its texture. You can't hear the wind, but the water movement brings to your memory the feeling of it. So as she gazes at the sky, you might remember how that bright light is in your eyes. According to Kroeber, when seeing a scene like the Green Sea opening, which stimulates the viewer to feel things in an almost psychosomatic experience, the filmmaker is not bringing knowing memories to light, but encouraging the viewer to imagine. We don't know the character background, but even with all imagery delivered instead suggested by a description like a novel, movies still stimulate us to imagine through different techniques. In movies, the viewer perceives motion through his eyes, but sees the perspective and angle of the director. The viewer sees what Randal wants him to see, emotions such as the sensation of entrapment with his duty, his social dislocation and sense of futurelessness, the attempt to cure loneliness and the nature as a shelter and healing source. Beyond expressing his feelings, Plunkett seems to provoke the viewer to feel as uncomfortable as he feels. Impeded to choose his future, Randal serves his audience with two different dishes. If on the one hand he dominates the experience of the movie with his perspective, on the other hand he offers to the viewer the possibility to create parts of the story without interrupting the movie, by anticipating events, making questions or suggesting what might happen to a character. Plunkett recreates artistically his life. He couldn't choose, just imagine what might be, such as his audience will not choose but imagine. In movies, anticipating events which the character is not aware of is one of the techniques which stimulates the audience's imagination. Kroeber calls it anticipatory imagining. This direct stimulus, according to the author, has the intention to instigate precise emotions. In this sequence of Out There, for example, the character walks around the car without noticing a hand on the ground. The information is given just to the viewer and clearly intended to spark curiosity and encourage one to imagine. The viewer is induced to visualize in his mind what will happen with the character after seeing it. A wiry teenage girl, dressed in camouflage, face wrapped in a scarf. The audience is not only the public stimulated to imagine and create in a movie. As Kroeber points out, well before the movie was being shot, an army of professionals began to conceive what the viewer will see in that visual storytelling, and as everything is placed to make the viewer believe and recognise as reality, the writer-director needs to involve the crew in an exercise of imagination.
So my experience with Randal as a director for Marauders, and especially towards my character Abby, was he was incredibly inviting and creative with me through the process of who Abby was. Like, straight away from the get-go, during my audition, I asked him, could I have a brief description of who she was? And he sent me probably only a paragraph of a small sliver of detail of who she was, and already he had given me so much to work with and to allow myself creatively then to build who she was as a person and her personality. And normally most directors wouldn't give you that opportunity. Sometimes they only give you, a brief description, and then they will get you to do the tape and see, does it land? Whereas I got that brief description, but it was just enough and it was perfect amount for me to then try and creatively build this character for myself.
As Kroeber argues, making a movie is a collective work which brings to the screen the view of the writer-director to the audience. Cast and crew are involved in an atmosphere, description and visual concepts which intend to hold all the parts of the movie together with coherence and truth.
There's the idea I have. The idea evolves into a script. There's an evolution again in the thing. Things are missed, things are lost, things are made in the edit. And then I go back to the edit and I go, no, it's not right. What is the story? What am I trying to express here? What is wrong with that I've done? And by the end, if I can go back and I look at it and say, it's all here, then I have a movie.
In this creative process, the crew and cast of Plunkett's movies share not only his vision of the story, but they share the experience of absorbing for a few days the inspirational atmosphere of Dunsany Estate. Not only in its natural and medieval locations, but in its fantasy stimulation, the experience of imagining is collective.
It was incredible for Randal to open up such a private part of his world, to see this part of his home to be opened up and to be utilised to create such an image in his head, and have that, nearly to have that pleasure to be, in this state, in this place where we can creatively, imagine these people and these stories and these circumstances was just so incredible, really, when I think about it. But even just the landscape itself, like, there was next to no effort really in trying to imagine where my character was going to be, or what they were feeling, or what they were doing. in these certain areas, and it just came to life. I think it was just the openness and the wild aspect of the place. It felt very timeless and yet consumed by the time that we were imagining for the movie.
Fantasies originate only in individual psyches, but an adult fantasy that is tightly enough structured through testing by a skeptical intelligence and practical knowledge becomes publicly accessible, inviting participation by others, as Kroeber argues. With this quote of Kroeber, we can infer that despite fantasy having its origin in an individual mind, it is possible to empower and energize the mind of others creatively with artistic creation. Through his descriptions, the 18th Lord Dunsany invites his readers to recreate Dunsany estate and characters with less interference than Edward with his paintings, for example. Edward's paintings provide part of the imagination, such as colour and scale, but do not reveal sequence of what might be happening. Randal's movies, however, need to appeal to a variety of techniques to stimulate the audience to imagine beyond what they are seeing. More important than his invitation to create is what they are trying to express. The Green Sea, Plunkett's last movie from 2021, is a collection of everything Dunsany represents, from its inhabitants to its heritage, from a source of inspiration to a set to the artistic creation. The movie tells the story of Simone, a musician who is trying to write a second book while struggling with personal conflicts. One day, reality and fantasy collide when the character of her book, the kid, comes to life. The movie is a book of memories and a piece being written which depicts many of Randal Plunkett's past, present anxieties with his responsibilities and desire for a different future. According to Kroeber, the successful communication of our subjectivity to others makes possible reciprocal intimacies unknown to any other creature. Storytelling nurtures this intimacy because stories are the principal language form that facilitates sharing the emotional, aspirational, and moral orientations of consciousness.
I create things in a web. Everything in every single one of my movies is directly related to me in some way. If you know me very well, you will probably recognize a good portion of those things. You will see that I tend to use the same motifs, the same ideas. There are certain things in my movies and in my written work and in my photographs. You tend to notice that there's a style, a repetitive theme.
The Green Sea portrays a juxtaposition of the artist at Dunsany and a variety of interesting references. Not only is the main character a writer representing Randal himself, but also reminds us of the 18th Lord Dunsany. Moreover, the whole film is structured with chapters like a book. The audience is reading a book while watching a movie. Plunkett goes further, sharing his fantasy when the viewer dives into the character's creative process while writing her own book. Suddenly the audience is watching a movie in a movie. Like the web that builds his stories, the viewer is invited to imagine two different layers of fantasy: Randal's movie and Simone's book. In some way, the audience gets a taste of what it's meant to be in Randal's skin when he is creating, inspired by the place that he lives in. When she is creating, the viewer creates. When she is interrupted, the viewer feels the cut in his mind too. Committed to engulf the viewer in a fantasy spiral, Plunkett serves to the viewer a third narrative, the journey of the turtle. The turtle is a sharp metaphor of the character's journey, which represents Randal's personal journey and the viewer who is accompanying Simone and the kid's plot, also accompanying the journey of the turtle and all its threats to find her way back to the ocean. The turtle who carries her home on its back all the time is also a representation of Randal's responsibility with his duty as caretaker of his home, which implies the history, the heritage, the building, the land, and the future of his family.
And I start to inject myself into everything because each character has a piece of myself. That's how I write. I try and say, how would I be in this situation? Catherine Isabel in The Green Sea dresses a bit like me most of the time. Has the mouth that I have sometimes. Very angry, very aggressive, doesn't like happiness, all that kind of stuff. Come on, I say the same shit all the time.
Yeah.
That should do you. Oh, wait. What's your name?
Simone.
Don't you want to know my name?
No. No, I don't give a shit. We're not friends, okay, kid? Fucking touch anything.
As The Green Sea was pointed out by Randal as autobiographical work, it is interesting to see how the other artists depict themselves through the art too. Edward has at least 3 self-portraits in different moments, and Lord Dunsany wrote his autobiography work in 3 parts. In addition, included several personal marks in The Curse of the Wise Woman. Paintings and filming like paintings is an influence of Edward's in Randal's art expression, as earlier shown in this video. Many of the stories are hung on the walls. Not only the painting content as part of the narrative, but also its asymmetrical position connotes that something unusual is happening there. When looking at the scene when Kid straightens a picture of Satan metal, one can infer that it is personally related with Randal Plunkett's musical taste, since he is known as a black metal fan.
And everything in the movie is on the walls. Everything about the character that you need to know is all there. When she's slamming the girl in the corridor, there's all the paintings on the walls are all the beach and the sea.
Art in Dunsany Estate is in constant flow. The lords were taught about each other over the years, and their achievements and creative mindsets are part of Plunkett's legacy. Crossing arts are also common among the lords. They are constantly driven by the force of creativity and a convergence of inspiration that can be expected at some point, even unconsciously. I remained hidden and silent and waited to see what that had frightened the rabbits, and saw nothing. And then I looked behind me, and there was the man standing of whom I have told you before, the man in the long black coat. To crow for this convergence has an explanation. My belief is that our ideas of aesthetic creativity are dominated by traditions of literature and the fine arts of painting and sculpture. What in filmmaking looks like hopeless confusion of self-destructive cross-purposes, in fact may sometimes be necessary to produce a dynamic of conflictual cooperation. Perhaps a kind of accidental achievement of meaningful form may be in some ways essential to a movie's formal viality. Knowing that in Plunkett's movies, these confluences are not accidental, but with significant purpose of correlations with his life, it's possible to think that The Green Sea is a movie which transforms his remembrances in something new to organise his mental environment. The house and nature in The Green Sea are metaphors for his inner and outer persona. The kid cleaning the house is a vision of the process of acceptance relating to the peerage. Randal stated several times in interviews his difficulties accepting his duty as Lord, which arose inner conflicts between his obligations and the freedom to choose his future. Nowadays, being a lord has a different weight in society than being a lord in the 19th and 20th centuries. While Edward, the 18th Lord Dunsany, participated actively in 2 world wars, Irish independence, the Anglo-Irish War, the establishment of the Free State and Republic, Edward, the 20th Lord Dunsany, was contemporary to Charles Haughey's neoliberal government of the 80s and the Celtic Tiger of the 90s. Both responding to demands of the world creatively, writing poems about the war, building edifications and accepting commissions. More than a way to keep the income, these creations register their moments as artists during times of uncertainties and also mark their presence to the future generations. Facing the demands of his time as Lord, such as the COVID-19 pandemic, in which his mother, Lady Dunsany, Maria Alisi, was one of the victims, and the climate crisis, Randal decided to use his privilege to change the world through actions towards nature. Dunsany Estate in the 21st Lord Dunsany era became Dunsany Nature Reserve and has had the chance to grow freely of human management. Through the rewilding project, Randal is giving to nature in his property what he never had: freedom.
I just like trees. Especially ones like this.
What's so good about them?
I guess they wear their scars proudly. and they just stand above all other life. My work is giving me shit. I just come out here and the trees sort of give me peace.
In depicting nature in the Green Sea, Plunkett is not only inviting the viewer to see the outcome of Simone, the kid, the turtle, and himself, but he is suggesting to the audience that nature offers a solution to their problems. And setting the things in these terms, the viewer identifies what he sees as possibility, the audience recognises reality. Despite being caretaker of the land being one of Plunkett's core values, nature in Dunsany Estate endured tough times in the 18th Lord Dunsany era. Edward John Morton Drax Plunkett was a known advocate for animal rights, giving special attention to domestic animals, such as his favourites, dogs. But at the same time, he couldn't avoid his taste for hunting, a blood mark that we can see on Dunsany Castle walls. The Curse of the Wise Woman describes several hunt moments, with details highlighting the sensation of the hunter during the chase. At some point when Charles, the main character, wins a foxbrush as a result of a hunting game, it affirms what the hunt meant to Lord Dunsany. I see then that it is a holy relic, and Laura said, yes, it is our religion. The behaviour towards nature was different during Edward John Carlos Plunkett's time. According to Randal, his father wasn't a hunter and had more consciousness about nature, something that he shared with his sons through talking about it, and through his paintings such as the Forest collection. The decision to protect nature at all cost brought some extreme actions, such as the moment in which Lady Dunsany, Maria Alisi, forced hunters to run off the estate while protecting the land with a rifle from the family's gun collection. Nowadays, Randal still needs to protect Dunsany Estate from hunters, but he also faces different threats, such as the possibility of having a train rail cutting through Dunsany Nature Reserve, something that he is willing to fight against with the same vigour as his mother before him. Once more, reality and fantasy are in a crashing course on Dunsany Estate. The Curse of the Wise Woman, written by Lord Dunsany in 1933, tells the story of a boy willing to protect an Irish bog threat by the Peat Development Ireland Syndicate. The boy, called Charles, uses all his power and privilege to avoid the destruction. He even calls supernatural forces to help. The 18th Lord Dunsany couldn't predict that his own land would one day be threatened during his great-grandson's time as Lord, but his writing about nature and danger to allow progress fits to Randal's reality today. Instead of seeking supernatural forces to help, Randal calls for attention through social media. And that one thing is that the bog itself was threatened. All the wild ways he had shown me, mosses and rushes, and the heather, the home of the curlew and snipe, and the grazing grounds of the geese, all those enchanted fields and the magical willows lying under the edge of the bog, all were to be spoiled, hidden, sold, and disenchanted by terrible force named progress. The Lords of Dunsany invite us to their inner world through art, but not in a trivial process. As their lives and personal questions become art, the ancient place, inherited and passed through the generations, becomes a fantasy world. In Edward John's writings, Edward John Carlos paintings, and Randal's movies, Dunsany is not only an inspiration and stage, but a place where they have the responsibility to protect. Writing, painting and filming Dunsany Estate allude to the Plunkett values as a way to preserve and share the family heritage.
So those rules are family rules. The blood is thicker than water kind of thing. In Dunsany, the rules have been set from the get-go. Those rules have to be followed, and there are rules. They're not everybody else's rules.
Being in somebody else's fantasy, as Kroeber says, is stimulating because it promotes a constant shift of place that motivates us to imagine being in others' skin, even while maintaining our own place. This shift between reality and fantasy happens in Dunsany's artists too. They follow rules that do not apply to their art, even their art exposing these rules in an artistic form. But how long would this fantasy heritage last?
Because when I die, it could be the passing of the guard, or it could be the end of Dunsany. I don't think about what I'm going to do. I think about what I'm setting up to be done 3 or 4 generations down the road. That's why the rewilding is a good thing.
Is the end of Dunsany the end of the artistic heritage too? Since the 5 values of Dunsany embrace everything that the Plunketts bring to home, achieve and create, could their artistic veins be lost?
I think there's always been an artistic flair to this family. I think it's part genetic, because when one looks at all the different generations, not all of them are artistic in the sense that they exercised art, but you can see that there's a lot of the mindset of an artist within many of the generations, from even the kinds of choices of what they put on the wall.
Somebody today knows my name. In a few generations, everything I've done here will probably be nothing. You know what I mean? There'll be wars, and maybe there'll be some remnants, or maybe they won't even remember who I was or who my parents were. And the only thing we can try and live is we have to do the right thing for our time and leave something better as best we can for the future.
Randal Plunkett, the 21st Lord Dunsany, has the hard work to keep his history and heritage alive by caretaking of his ancient land and home. Furthermore, through his art, he catalogues his heritage to be seen for the next generations. He guarantees that the ones after him will imagine Dunsany in ways that was by his father Edward, and his father by his grandfather, through his writings.
So I think there was always an artistic resonance in the family. I think it's very hard not to be pulled into the ether about this place. This area has a lot of mythology. It has a lot of electric signals coming through here, whether that's from a nature or from other things. And it's hard to ignore that there is something here.
The Lords of Dunsany cannot change the family rules, but they can choose how to live these rules, adding meaningful marks to the Plunkett's history during their time as lords. Nowadays, nature in Dunsany Estate is the greatest statement that fantasy can be used as a device to transform reality. In Dunsany Castle, home of the Irish fantasy, imagination is a 6th core value.